The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, the finance minister is now limiting debate on his massive 800-page omnibus budget bill. So I have some questions for him if he has the courage to stand up in his place and answer those questions. The deficit is 3 times what he promised this year. He said it would be about $6 billion during the election campaign, and instead it's $18 billion. Next year, the budget was supposed to balance itself. That's only a month from now, 2019. That was the year when we were supposed to be deficit-free. That tiny, temporary deficit was supposed to be gone. And now the government admits not only will it not be gone, it will be bigger next year than it is this year, as this Prime Minister stacks another $20 billion on the national credit card. Now, when governments use deficit spending to buy products and services in a tight economy, they drive up prices for consumers. When they go out and borrow $20 billion more a year, they compete with homeowners and consumers for credit and drive up interest rates. In other words, deficits not only drive up taxes tomorrow, they drive up the cost of living today. So will the finance minister tell the House how much are his massive deficits driving up interest rates on Canadians trying to pay their mortgages?
Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about our record just in the short 3 years that we've had the opportunity and the privilege to form government. You know, after 10 years of Conservative inaction, we committed to Canadians that we would invest in the middle class, that we'd help grow our economy, and we've delivered on that promise, Mr. Speaker, through the implementation of the Canada Child Benefit, which has raised well over 300,000 children out of poverty, through the middle class tax cut, cutting taxes for 9 million middle class Canadians and raising them on the richest 1%. The average Canadian family, Mr. Speaker, is $2,000 better off now than they were under the Harper Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, the party opposite likes to talk about their support for small business, but it's actually our government that cut small taxes for businesses from 11% to 9%, meaning small business owners will have on average $1,200 more to reinvest in their businesses. That's real support for the small business and job creators, which, Mr. Speaker, I might add, have added over 500,000 full-time jobs in the 3 short years that we've formed government. Madam Speaker, we're very pleased of our record. We're very proud of this particular piece of legislation and the work that we're doing to grow our economy.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sudbury-Sur-Roy. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I find it unacceptable to see a time allocation motion on such a large bill. There are 850 pages, 7 pieces of legislation being changed, 7 acts, and the Liberals were fiercely opposed to the previous government's moving of bills of that size. And they were only 300 pages at the time. This is 3 times almost as long. Members of Parliament have hardly had time to debate it. What have we had? Some 2 days? Now our time is being limited. The NDP asked for the bill to be split, to have an opportunity to take the time to look into it. But most Liberals, I'm sure, haven't even had an opportunity to go through it, even a fifth of it. So how can the minister see the pertinency of this, and how can she agree with proceeding in this way?
Thank you,
Minister.
Speaker, and I will tell you that Canadians elected us to deliver on an ambitious plan, an agenda, which we are doing. This is a bill that's been debated extensively in the House. In fact, we've seen more than 15 hours of debate at second reading and report stage debate. It includes 22 Conservative members, 8 NDP members, 1 member for the Bloc Québécois, a committee stage of which, by the way, it was studied under 4 separate committees. We've had 8 meetings during which more than 45 witnesses have spoken. We've accepted some amendments as a result of that careful deliberation. Madam Speaker, Canadians expect us to continue on our ambitious agenda, and that's exactly what we're doing today.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Brantford Brant.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And as we stand and realize that the broken promises from the last election to run small deficits and come back to balance is obviously something that was thrown out the window in the very early days of this government. You know, the small business reduction was something that we had, as Conservatives, put on the books to do. They chose not to do it until they were pressured by small business itself to actually, because of the tax reforms that they wanted to actually add taxation to small business rose up and made them reverse and walk back what they were going to do. That's the reality of the situation. You see, the reality of the situation is the Prime Minister has said the budget will balance itself, yet they cannot answer the basic question, when will the budget balance itself? Fundamental things that you make promises to people during an election campaign, yet you come here and you try to spin it that because of their desire to tax and spend the Canadian public, that's for the greater good. Well, it's not for the greater good, Madam Speaker. When will they balance the budget?
The honourable minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I find it hilarious, the phrase "put on the books to do." They had a decade to do this, Madam Speaker, and clearly they didn't. And we, in fact, Madam Speaker, are the party that moved forward with a commitment to supporting small business and are implementing those commitments, Madam Speaker. In fact, they had a commitment to grow the economy. A decade of inaction led to a stagnation of an economy where fewer jobs were created, where businesses struggled, where our economy struggled. In fact, now we see one of the fastest growing economies in the G7. Madam Speaker, unemployment rates that are the lowest that we've seen in 40 years, wage growth. We're seeing all kinds of positive economic growth as a result of our ambitious agenda, which we will continue to deliver for Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I know we had a late night last night, but I do want to remind members that when someone has the floor, that person deserves a respect. The honourable member for Brantford Brant had an opportunity to ask the question, and if he has other questions, he can stand up and ask those as opposed to yelling them across the way. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Madam Speaker, my question to the Minister of Finance is this. The Liberals, actually, during the campaign, did not say to Canadians that they would spend $4.5 billion to buy a leaky pipeline, but yet that is what they're doing. And instead of doing that, why don't we see the government investing that money into green energy, into the future, where climate action is so necessary, not just for our generation today, but for generations to come. So that's my question to the Minister of Finance. Why don't we reinvest that $4.5 billion to buy the Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain leaky pipeline into action that matters for the future, for the environment?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I share the member's passion for the environment, and that's why, in fact, we have proposed a price on pollution, because Canadians know that pollution isn't free, and we're all paying for the cost of storms and floods and droughts and wildfires and extreme heat. And so our government has a plan to protect the environment and grow the economy, and it's working. Our emissions are down. Canadians have created over 500,000 full-time jobs since we were elected, and we know we need to do more. And that's why we're going to move forward in ensuring a price across Canada on what we don't want, which is pollution, so we can get what we do want, which is lower emissions and cleaner air, new business opportunities, and more money in the pockets of Canadians. Madam Speaker, we know that Andrew Scheer's plan is...
I just want to remind the member she's not to mention the names of individuals that are sitting in the House, and I would ask her to wrap up so that other questions can be asked.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I apologize. We know that the Leader of the Opposition's plan is to follow Stephen Harper by making pollution free again. And, Madam Speaker, we're taking action to protect our climate, to ensure the health of this place for generations to come.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Louis-Saint-Laurent. Madam Speaker, more than ever, the Liberals are showing that they lack respect not only for Canadians but also for this House. Once again today, they're trying to limit debate on an omnibus bill. It's over 800 pages, and it directly affects people's wallets. Let's remember, Madam Speaker, that just 3 years ago these people were elected saying that they would just run 3 modest deficits and that would be it, and then they would balance the budget in 2019. But we've seen 3 huge deficits, $60 billion in 3 years, and we don't know when they're going to balance the budget. They're scrapping all of their promises, and it's shameful. So, Madam Speaker, to the Minister of Finance, I'd like him to rise in this House and tell us when we'll balance the budget.
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, Madam Speaker, it's my pleasure to represent the Government of Canada today to defend our record on growing the economy. In fact, after 10 years of slow growth, Canada's economy has rebounded, and we now have one of the strongest records of growth in the G7. The economy has created over 500,000 full-time jobs since we've been in office, Madam Speaker. We see growth in all different sectors, Madam Speaker. We see employers with positive attitudes, in fact, having new problems as a result of the lowest unemployment rate in over 40 years, Madam Speaker. As a Minister of Employment, when I travel across the country now and meet with employers, one of the biggest challenges they have is not enough talent, and that is a testament to how fast our economy is growing under our leadership. Thank you.
Just want to remind members again, if they have questions, to stand up as opposed to yelling them across the way. I know that some of you may be tired. However, there is still rules to be followed. The honourable member for Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And just recently in my community, I participated in a Chew on This event where people, multi-faith community, came together and talked about how we can address poverty in our community. What are we doing and the steps that can be needed? And one of the things that I thought was interesting, because it's organized by Dignity for All, is that many of the requests that have been put forward by Dignity for All in respect of a Canada Child Benefit, an indexed Canada Child Benefit, a Canada Workers Benefit, have been addressed by our government and have been in our past budgets. And I was hoping that the minister could perhaps help us to understand what is our government doing to address poverty issues in our country to ensure everyone has opportunities.
Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's a fantastic question because, in fact, the kinds of actions that we've been taking since we formed government have the goal of ensuring that the most vulnerable Canadians have an opportunity to participate as fully as every other Canadian in our society, in our economy. So things like our historic housing plan, the housing strategy, but the Canada Child Benefit, which can't be overstated as it has lifted over 300,000 children out of poverty, a poverty reduction strategy that has concrete targets so we can actually measure our progress. Madam Speaker, the work that I am doing as a Minister of Employment, ensuring decent work and modernizing the Canada Labour Code so the most vulnerable workers in our federally regulated workplaces have basic protections as employees. The list goes on, Madam Speaker. I'm extremely proud of the record of this government on ensuring that every Canadian has a fair chance to succeed. We will continue to invest in the kinds of things that help people move along the continuum to prosperity and ensure that they have fairness in their opportunities in this country. Thank you.
And comments, the honourable member from Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It was 42 years ago that Prime Minister Trudeau promised to legislate pay equity for Canadian women, equal pay. Didn't happen. Successive Liberal and Conservative governments delayed action. It was 3 years ago that the NDP got the Liberal government now to change their agenda and include pay equity. We were delighted they said yes. The next 3 years were a black hole. We didn't know what was happening. Ostensibly, there were consultations with the NGOs. Then pay equity legislation got bundled into this 800-page omnibus bill. It was rushed through at every single stage. Even still, the NGOs that have been working, the human rights lawyers that have been litigating this issue in court for 3 decades, proposed very specific amendments, which I was honoured, along with the member for New Westminster Burnaby, to advance at the Finance Committee a week ago. So I spent from 9 in the morning until noon moving amendments that had been made to pay equity legislation by the Teamsters, by CUPE, by Equal Pay Ontario Coalition, by the Canadian Labour Congress, and the Liberals voted every single amendment down. They said they knew best, much better than the Labour activists and the human rights lawyers that have been litigating this. So why did the government refuse every amendment on pay equity, and why are they jamming this budget bill through now with no changes?
Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm incredibly proud to be the minister that has introduced pay equity, along with my colleagues, to Canadian women in federally regulated workplaces who will see equal pay for work of equal value. Madam Speaker, this legislation was carefully crafted in consultation, as the member opposite references, with NGOs, with experts, with employers, with workers, to make sure that we got the balance right, Madam Speaker. On one hand, the member opposite is saying that it took too long for this legislation to come, and on the second hand, the member is saying that we're moving too quickly. Canadian women are expecting us to act now. We're proud of this legislation, Madam Speaker. We look forward to employers in federally regulated sectors coming up with proactive pay equity plans in the near future. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the debate right now is on the issue of time allocation and not on the substance of C-86, I just want to once again make it clear that the use of time allocation as a routine proceeding is completely unacceptable. I ask the Honourable Minister to reconsider, and I will say in the substance of her remarks in answer to a question, she said that this legislation and the government's actions protect Canadians for generations to come. I'd have to correct her. As it now stands, we haven't protected the next generation, much less generations to come. I urge her to read the IPCC report on what we must do to reduce emissions so that we can hold to 1.5 degrees and no more.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, Madam Speaker, Canadians elected us to move forward on a very important agenda. It's an ambitious agenda, one that we have moved diligently to ensure that we can actually enact. And so this is an important part of that agenda, Madam Speaker. In fact, this bill has been debated extensively in the House. In fact, we've seen more than 15 hours of debate. It includes 22 Conservative members, 8 NDP members, 1 member from Bloc Québécois. At committee stage, of which there were 4 committees studying this legislation, Madam Speaker, we've had 8 meetings during which more than 45 witnesses have spoken. Madam Speaker, we've made a commitment to work diligently on behalf of Canadians to enact the agenda for which they voted 3 years ago. I'm proud to be part of a government that takes those commitments seriously. Thank you.
Comments? The honourable member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, the government, as they often do, stands up and says, Canadians elected us to blah, 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 or in 2015, Canadians voted for blah, blah, blah. But I think the legacy of this government is going to be a government that said a whole bunch of things back in 2015 and then did a whole bunch of different things in the 4 years following. And you're hearing that in questions from members from all parties regarding the things they said around closure, the things they said around omnibus bills, the things they said about electoral reform, and of course, as they said in their 2015 platform, after the next 2 fiscal years, this is a direct quote, the deficit will decline and our investment plan will return Canada to a balanced budget in 2019. So my question for the minister is clear. There's a very, very clear promise regarding a balanced budget in 2019. She has a lot of very rosy things to say about the Canadian economy. So what is the rationale? What is the reason that the government would give to the Canadian people for the fact that they're running so desperately behind their promise, their projection for the balance that they made just 3 years ago?
Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, the Canadians chose a different approach in the last election. They chose a government that had confidence to invest in Canadians, to invest in Canadian businesses, and to help our economy grow. And just 3 short years later, we see that that approach is working, Madam Speaker. Over 500,000 full-time jobs added to our economy by small, medium-sized businesses who have seen prosperity, seen the opportunities, and are looking to grow themselves and contribute to the growth of our economy. Madam Speaker, we ended the Conservative approach of sending child benefit taxes to millionaires so we can provide more support to 9 out of 10 Canadian families. And believe me, Madam Speaker, this is providing confidence in those families that they will have what they need to raise children that are happy and healthy and can fully participate in Canadian society. Madam Speaker, we're proud of our record. We know that we're on the right track. Canadians know we're on the right track, and we're going to continue to work hard to achieve Canada where everybody has a fair chance to succeed.
Comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
you very much, Madam Speaker. Now, it's quite interesting to note that Conservatives want a balanced budget. So where are they exactly going to cut? They say want a balanced budget, and I would remind the House that the balanced budget that they had when they were still in government was made on the backs of veterans, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous children, and indeed it was a very, very dark decade. The question is before us today is, do we invest in people today, or do we see a long-term loss in health, education, lost economic potential, the lost potential of Canadians? And I think this budget is about investing in the human potential of Canadians, ensuring that people have the tools to be successful. Now, we can cut or we can invest today, or we have to pay the cost later on as a Canadian society.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will say that I share the member's passion and perspective that when we invest in people in Canadian society, when we invest in our small and medium-sized businesses, that is good fiscal policy, because in fact it's very expensive to do nothing. Having said that, we are very committed to sound fiscal management as we continue to make investments that are going to contribute to that long-term economic growth. And that's exactly what we're talking about here today, Madam Speaker. We're talking about investing in Canadian families. We're talking about eliminating child poverty. Madam Speaker, when we actually help children grow up where they're not hungry, where they have opportunity, where they have the same opportunities as their peers, in fact, what we are contributing to is the next generation of profit, of wealth, of growth, of business, of profitable employees, of also business owners. And Madam Speaker, when we invest in people having a fair chance, Canadians don't let us down. They take that chance, they take that opportunity, and they contribute directly to their communities and to their country. Thank you.
Comments? The Honourable Member for Desnethé, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Thank you for this opportunity. I like to remind the Minister and the government of the realities on the ground when it comes to poverty, child poverty, when it comes to lack of infrastructure for communities and reserves across Canada. Our youth across Canada, Indigenous youth, are struggling, and they do not have the support of the government to invest in their future. How can this government sit here and falsely give us information saying Canada's great, Canada's moving forward, when it isn't? When I hear about suicides, when I hear about roads being inaccessible, when I hear about job cuts in my riding and across northern Canada, I want to hear an effective plan from the government.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and we share the member opposite's passion for equity for Indigenous people. And as the Minister of Employment, I can tell you one of my proudest moments was being able to increase the Aboriginal Skills Education Training Program to ensure equity for Indigenous people who are looking to improve skills training. But not only that, Madam Speaker, we've invested in housing. We've invested significantly in ending boil water advisories. Of course, there's more to do. We continue to work with Indigenous leaders and communities to ensure that we can work in partnership. Unlike the Conservative government, who didn't invest in Indigenous communities, who didn't support Indigenous people for equity, who for a decade did not increase the Aboriginal Skills Education Training Program, Madam Speaker, as just one example of inequity, we are taking a different approach. We are working with Indigenous communities. We are investing in those things that we call the social determinants of health, things like housing, things like health care. We are transforming child welfare. Madam Speaker, we are on a good journey together, and I am proud to be part of a government that works collaboratively with Indigenous people for equity and for that equal shot at success.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Rise today again on time allocation called on a budget bill over 800 pages long. Should we be surprised by this? Unfortunately, no. We've got a government here that promised not to introduce omnibus bills, and yet we have a bill that's almost 900 pages long. They campaigned on a multiple of things, deficits no more than $10 billion. They've broken that promise. They promised increasingly or decreasing deficits over their term. They've broken that promise. They promised to return to a balanced budget in 2019. They've broken that promise. But what they're really breaking is their oath or their responsibility to future generations. We heard one minister talk about what they're providing or how they're building for the future generations. I'd like the Minister of Finance to answer, how can he feel that he's doing the right thing, but when what he is really doing is passing on increasing debt to these future Canadians? debt with a deficit of nearly $20 billion each of every 3 years. That's $600 in debt for every man, woman, and child. Every man, woman, and child, almost $600 further in debt every year because of this government, and this is the debt load that they're building. Here they are today trying to stop debate on this bill so that we can point out the flaws in their omnibus bill. I'd like the minister to answer why he's doing that.
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And when Conservatives were last in government, annual GDP growth was just 1%, and Canadians were worried that we might be headed into a recession. Under our plan, GDP growth has rebounded, and Canada now has one of the strongest records of growth in the G7 at 3%. This is the strongest growth of all G7 countries last year. Madam Speaker, we're proud of our record. During the last election, Canadians chose a different approach. They chose between the Conservative plan for austerity and cuts. One could argue that was the NDP plan as well, and they chose a plan, our government's plan, to invest in the middle class, to build an economy that works for everyone. Madam Speaker, when Canadians feel that they have a fair chance to succeed, when their children have a fair chance to succeed, they invest in themselves, they invest in their communities, they invest into this country, and in fact, Canadians are proving just that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
In comments, the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know, the minister earlier answered the question to say that they're doing a whole lot on the climate action file. Just to remind the government that they're actually adopting Harper's targets, and even at that, they're not going to meet those targets. Now, I want to ask another question. The government brags about the housing file to say that they have a national affordable housing program. The truth of the matter is 90% of that money won't flow until after the next election. So my question is, can people who are homeless today, who are in desperate need to have a home, to have shelter, and to have a safe place to go to, does the minister actually think that it's appropriate to defer the money in flowing the dollars to build the housing until after the next election?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And in fact, in our first budget, we invested $5.8 billion in housing across this country. It was just a down payment, Madam Speaker. We have an ambitious housing strategy that will eliminate homelessness by 50% in a decade. Madam Speaker, in fact, investments were made in the member opposite's riding in affordable housing, as she may know. If not, we're happy to tell her about those investments at any point. Madam Speaker, this is really one of the reasons I went into politics. And in fact, as a former executive director of a homeless shelter in northwestern Ontario, I can tell you that investing in affordable housing is one of the best ways to actually help people out of poverty and move people along the continuum and ensure that they too have a fair chance at success. It was my extreme pleasure to be one of the ministers to be able to talk about the housing strategy when it was launched. I will continue to work with my colleagues from any side that wants to work on this issue with us, because it's incredibly important. It will contribute to the prosperity and the fair chance for every Canadian. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, here we are again, an 800-plus page Budget Implementation Act. And who's answering the questions? Not the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Employment. Now, she brags that there's been 15 hours of debate. 15 hours debate on a massive budget implementation bill, and yet here's the Minister of Employment answering the question. And perhaps it's because she is used to this undemocratic process. After all, this was the minister who forced the C-89 through this House with limited debate. But then in the other place, the other unelected place, she allows a massive study. She allows those to come in as witnesses. This is the same minister who took away the right to a secret ballot for unionization. And yet here she is. Here's the Minister of Employment answering questions because the Minister of Finance will not. Will she answer one simple question? When will the budget be balanced?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, Madam Speaker, as tempting as it is for me to talk about the member opposite's party's record on their relationship with organized labour, I will pass on that temptation, and I will stay focused. I will stay focused, Madam Speaker, on our incredible record of ensuring prosperity for every Canadian in this country. Madam Speaker, when we were elected through the vision of Canadians who saw a different way. For over a decade, the previous government had led austerity budgets, had invested in the wrong things, leading to stagnation of growth, leading to a loss of hope by Canadians that there would be a bright future for themselves and for their children. Well, Madam Speaker, we've reversed that. We see one of the fastest growing economies in the G7. We see the lowest unemployment record in 40 years. Madam Speaker, as a Minister of Employment, it is my privilege to meet with employer groups from all across this country, and one of the things they tell me that they need most profoundly is new talent. And that's because, Madam Speaker, we have one of the highest records of employment since the 40s, where Canadians are working to their full capacity. Madam Speaker, we are proud of our record. We are ensuring that Canadians have the money they need to raise their children, whether it's through the Canada Child Benefit, whether it's through a reduction of middle-class tax cuts, which will result in an average of $2,000 more per couple across this country. Madam Speaker, when Canadians feel confidence in the economy, they invest in themselves, they invest in their communities, and they help grow our economy. Thank you.